Welcome on Easy Learning. Now I am going to cover the next part of the chapter, the story of poetry. By mistake, the last part of the video went to be stopped, but I am again just continuing it and resuming the video, and I will keep on reading in this part of the video of this chapter. So you can just go through my last part of the video for the audio purpose as well as this part of the video. So let's start. I am going to again start from this paragraph. The Romantic Revival in English poetry is often associated with the works of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The movement refers to a renewed interest in nature and simple life, an interest in the past and the exotic. Don't you notice certain common things in the works of the poets? Individualism, free play of imagination, and a humanitarian outlook. You may regard it a democratic or liberalizing movement. The poets sought to do away with the rigid application of classic norms and conventions in their writing. In this regard, you will have to remember the great influence of the French Revolution that made liberty, equality, and fraternity the very basic of social life. There were also certain other influences at work. The writings of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the works of German Esquilgel brothers, August Wilhelm and Frederick, and the growing interest in ballads and English medieval literature, Bishop Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry 1765 kindled this interest. Wordsworth wrote lyrics, ballads, odes, sonnets, verse tales, and reflective poems. Be it Lucy poems or the prelude, his love or nature is always prominent. Nature for him is a spiritual presence. It provides creative training to human sensibility. It may be an interesting fact to know that Coleridge joined Wordsworth in the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, 1798, the book which gave a new direction to English poetry. While Wordsworth represented the familiar as unfamiliar, Coleridge did the reverse. In Kubla Khan, the Ancient Mariner, and Christabel, Coleridge shows his interest in medieval folklore and legend. Other poets like Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats are regarded the younger romantics. Byron's works, Manfred Cain, Childe Harold, Vision of Judgment, and Don Juan show his passion for liberty and defiance of convention. Shelley as a poet is a revolutionary idealist. Some of his well-known poems are Adonias, the Skylark, the Cloud, the Ode to the West Wind, and Revolt of Islam, and Queen Mab. In his longer poem, he gives vent to his passion for reform. In the shorter poems like Odes and Lyrics, he laments the hardships into which he has landed. In Keats' narrative poems like The Eve of St. Agnes Lamia, the Odes and Ballads, we find his sensitive approach to the beauty of nature. He has also an admiration for the Greek love of perfection, the most striking quality of Keats' poetry in its appeal to the senses. In the following lines from Ode to Psyche, the words present to the eye to the picture of the nature. Hushed cool rooted flowers, fragrant tide, blue, silver, white, and budded terrain. As we proceed further, we find Queen Victoria ascending the throne. The period from 1837 to 1901 witnessed some important events: the rise of democracy, the expansion of the British Empire, and the progress of science and technology. A number of inventions and discoveries took place during the period. The most significant of them was Darwin's theory of the origin of a species. It had the greatest impact on the age. It challenged the biblical version of the creation and shook people's faith in Christianity. Despite this, Romantic tradition continued in the later part of the 19th century. However, the rise of democracy and the expansion of the reading public changed function of poetry. It came to be related more to life than the Romantic. The representative poets of age, Alfred Tennyson, Robert Brownings, and Matthew Arnold, gave voice to the common man's doubts, fears, and distractions. At the same time, they reassured them that all was right with the world. Tennyson's poems and well-known elegy in memoriam make an attempt to reconcile the conflicting claims of science and religion. Browning's poetry made use of new technique known as dramatic monologue. It is used to explore the thoughts and feelings of the poet himself. Arnold describes poetry as the criticism of life. His Sohrab and Rustam, The Scholar Gypsy, and some memorable poems, Dover Beach, expresses the doubts and frustrations of the age. At the same time, he insists on a code of conduct. For him, the object of poetry is to make men happy. Besides these poets, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, A.C. Swinburne, C.G. Rossetti also deserve our attention. They are known as pre-Raphaelites. The term owes its name to school of painting called the Pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood. It aimed to revive in poetry the ideal of painting sincerity, simplicity, and truth to life that inspired the Italian painters before Raphael. In the works of these poets, there is a stress on beauty, an interest in Middle Ages, and use of words for their pictorial quality. Gerard Manley Hopkins is a poet different from his age. His poems were published in 1918 after his death. His poems normally deal with religious aspects of life. Some of his poems like Pied Beauty portray nature, but he certainly turns away from the romantic style of poetry. His imagery and rhythm are quite modern and has influenced many poets on the 20th century. English poetry in the 20th century is varied in theme but more sensitive to the new crisis in human life. Poets like Robert Bridges, A.E. Housman, and John Mansfield continued with the romantic themes. They also expressed the pessimism of the age. Walter de la Mare, in his Songs for Children, Peacock Pie, and other poems, explores the wonder of the child's world and the fantasy of the supernatural world. The poets who had Irish origin were rooted in the history and tradition of Ireland. Poets like W. B. Yeats, J. M. Synge, and Lord Dunstan looked to their own country for inspiration. W. B. Yeats, 1865 to 1939, in the poems such as Among School Children, Sailing to Byzantium, and Second Coming, reveals his concern for youth, age, and the possibility of regeneration. The early part of the 20th century witnessed World War I, along with annihilation of life and property. It brought disillusionment and frustration. The poets voiced the concern that knowledge and progress could not save humanity. Some of the early poets, like Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen, had an ideal view on more. T.S. Eliot, 1888 to 1965, was certainly the most influential poet of the time. In his early poems, such as the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and the Westland, he presents the hollowness and vulgarity of the modern civilization, which does not have any awareness of spiritual values. His later poems, such as Ash Wednesday and Four Quatrains, portray the disillusionment, agony, and search for values. During the 1930s, a group of poets such as W. H. Auden, Cecil D. Lewis, Louis MacNeice, and Stephen Spender reacted against art for art's sake. They tried to combine Marxist philosophy with Freud's psychology. Auden in his poems 1930 and particularly Look Stranger reveals his impatience with capitalism. William Empson and Dylan Thomas belong to another group of poets who sought to escape from the world of ideas and problems. They chose to express the inner chaos through devices such as ambiguity and inexact. Dylan Thomas was new romantic. His poems have rich Freudian overtones. They explore the relation between man and his natural environment. During and after the World War II, English poetry became quite diverse. It is difficult to use any single defining term or movement. The significant poets of the period are Thomas Gunn, Ted Hughes, Donald Dave, and Philip Larkin, while Hughes in Jaguar and Hawk Roasting depict violence and ferocity of animal as well as human world. Larkin was an anti-romantic who presents in an objective way the harsh realities such as time and death. Some of the distinctive poets writing during the 1980s and 1990s are Blake Morrison, Peter Reading, and Craig Wren. Women poets such as Edith Sitwell, Steve Smith, Elizabeth Jennings, and Carol Ann Duffy made their presence felt in the second part of the 20th century. They touched sensitive aspects of relationship between husband and wife and mother and children. The story of English poetry will remain incomplete if we do not take into account poets from the Commonwealth countries who also used English language for creative purposes. The use of English in America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Nigeria, and in Caribbean islands is certainly the result of British colonialism. What was first the language of commerce and administration soon emerged as a natural medium of exploring and understanding social realities. American poetry in English began from the American War of Independence. It was basically patriotic but imitative of English poetry. The real poetry, however, was written during the period 1850 to 55, also called the American Renaissance. The favorite poets of the 19th century were Edgar Allan Poe and W.H. Longfellow. Longfellow was a storyteller in verse. Do you remember his A Psalm of Life? Except for E. A. Robinson, Robert Frost, and Carl Sandburg. American poetry in the early 20th century was largely experimental. Frost portrays countryside with a tone of sadness and hint of life's responsibility. Poets like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, William Carroll Williams, and E. Cummings used concrete images and precise words to represent ideas and attitudes of mind. Pound and Eliot made significant contribution by their objective and impersonal account of the degeneration and depravity of modern life. Most of the American poets writing in English were engaged in twofold tasks: to define the self and to identify the nation. The two concerns often merge in the question, what is an American? In India, poetry began to be written as early as the early part of the 19th century. Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, Kasi Prasad Ghosh, Toru Dutt, and Manmohan Ghosh were the pioneers. Their major concerns were patriotism and the glorious past of India. Sarojini Naidu, also known as the Nightingale of India, wrote poems with ease. Her poems such as Village Song, Songs of Radha, and A Soul's Prayer reveal the real heart of India. Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate, in the Gitanjali, and Aurobindo Ghosh in the Savitri made moral and spiritual quest. Their poetry was an attempt to restore the lost glory of India. Indian poetry in English matured and began to express modern Indian sensibility in the latter part of the 20th century. Poets like Nissim Aizkiel, A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathy, Jayant Mahapatra, P. Lal, K.K. N. Daruwala, Shiv K. Kumar, Pritish Nandi, Arun Kolatkar and Kamla Das transformed Indian poetry in English. When Aizkiel describes the island of Bombay as unsuitable for song as well as sense, the island flowers in slums, and skyscrapers reflecting precisely the growth of my mind. He voices the disillusionment of his age. At the same time, he uses controlled statements with ironical meaning. The language was suitable for depicting harsh realities of life. Kamla Das is more bold and bitter in portraying her frustration as a woman. Canadian poetry is quite varied in its thematic concerns. Some of the poets, like Janet Armstrong, Claire Harris, Kyril Davidin, and Arnold Itwaro, suggest a closeness to and harmony with nature. It reflects the natives' concept of the land as mother. Their poetic works, First People, Blood of My Country, and Wind Woman by Armstrong, translation into fiction by Harris, The Forest by Davidin, and Sacred Presence by Arnold Itwaro, are rich in symbols and metaphors. These depict the agony of the colonialism and an intense search for roots. Margaret Atwood. The Circle Came, The Animals in That Country, Robert Crostek's The Stone Hammer, Poems and Seed Catalogue, and Fredwa Berathin, My Name with a Sigh, are some other representative Canadian poets in English. The Montreal group of poets such as A.G.M. Smith and A.M. Klein uses simple language to express the metaphysical agony of the uprooted people. It is quite interesting to know that we have some of the finest poetic utterances by the Nigerian, Caribbean, African and South African poets. These are the poets committed to a cause. South African poets like Dennis Brutus, Silence, Knuckles, Boots, Stubborn Hope, and Chinua Achebe, Beware Soul, Brother, Christmas in Biafra, record the violence and torture, the white rule. They wrote against the intrusion of Western customs into their native culture. Wol Soyinka, a Nigerian poet, reveals an uncompromising sense of justice and humanity. In his poems from prison, he tries to locate traditional African beliefs in modern life. He got Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. Chinua Achebe, basically novelist, is another important Nigerian poet. In his Beware Soul Brother and Christmas in Biafra, he resents the loss of traditional values. Dennis Brutus, a South African poet, is an opponent of apartheid. In his Silence, Knuckles, Boots, and Stubborn Hope, he voices the suffering and agony of the fellow black. Derrick Wolcott, who got Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992, worked for a Caribbean culture. His famous poetic works are In a Green Night, The Castaway, The Gulf, and the autobiographical poem Another Life. He has tried to develop English as the language of the educated people, where nothing was the language of a race. This discussion clearly shows that English as a language is spoken in many parts of the world. Not only this, poets from the Commonwealth nations and from African and Asian countries have successfully used English for creative purposes. They have added variety to and infused vitality into what we today call English poetry. Would you not agree that English poetry does not mean today poetry written by English poets alone? It is the total body of poetry being written in English in any part of the world. So I hope that you would have enjoyed the reading. Now, in the next parts of the video, I will explain them respectively.